morning, everybody, and welcome to this week's Cartesian Talks. I'm particularly excited by this week's. We have, as usual, the super smart Anthea Gardner, the host of the series, who, as always, is going to help us make sense of the markets and help us make better use of our money and help us to stay on our financial journey. But Anthea's also got a guest with us this morning, and I have no doubt that we are going to be blown away by Judith February. And before I hand over to Anthea, who's going to do a short presentation, and then we're going to move over to Judith, I'd like to introduce Judith up front. So Anthea describes Judith, and Anthea has known her for a long time, as somebody who's got her feet on the ground. And Anthea was particularly keen that she gives us a bit of an objective view around politics and with her eloquence and being erudite, as Anthea says. And I must add that whilst Anthea's slightly biased, I fact-checked all of this and it's completely true. So Judith is a lawyer, but she's one of those people that can't be described in just one word or one profession. She's been a columnist, wrote for the Cape Times, writes for the Daily Maverick. She's a governance specialist. She's a non-executive director of Coronation, where she chairs the subcommittee on ethics and transformation. She's a chair of a school board. And just because that's not enough, in between it all, she's written a book called Turning and Turning, exploring the complexities of South Africa's democracies. And in her spare time, she's also a trustee of the Nelson Mandela Foundation. So we have got two super smart people with us this morning. Anthea, we are really looking forward to hear what you and Judith have got to say about the factors affecting our rand and where we should be investing our rand. So a big welcome to you, Anthea, and over to you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much again, Carol. So this morning, we're talking about this great currency called the rand, and I'm sharing my screen with you. Does that work for everyone? Just a quick yes would be good.
Perfect.
Okay, so for the record, every single time I think about prepping these webinars, I think I must not bore my audience with lots of graphs. But a picture does paint 1,000 words, I'm afraid. So I still have managed to get away, well, I haven't managed, I should say, to get away with doing all these graphs. The first one, the rand-dollar exchange rate. So I've intentionally taken out the time period on the x-axis. And let me remind you, as that green line climbs higher, it means the rand is weakening. So look at this graph. What a volatile currency. If you give me a second, I just have to take the other screens out the way so that even I can, oops. Sorry, I can see it. It doesn't work for me either. What's going on here? Sorry about this. There we go. So the graph starts off at 1732, spikes to 1748, retreats back to 1732, strengthens even more all the way to 1724. I mean, that'll make any trader seasick. But believe it or not, this is a graph of the rand during the trading day on Tuesday, this Tuesday past, when our governor of the Reserve Bank was talking at a Standard Bank conference. Firstly, can you believe that there are people like me out there that actually tune into that stuff? But seriously, in this economic environment, what could this man possibly have said that could have made our currency strengthen as much as it did? So let's leave that for a minute and look at yesterday's trading graph. We start in the morning with Asian trade, where our currency remains relatively flat. And then there's a whole lot of weakening during our morning trade until the afternoon, when our Honorable Finance Minister gets onto our screens and delivers probably the worst budgetary news South Africa has ever had to deal with. And look what happens. As he speaks, the rand strengthens. The economy is expected to contract by 7.2% this year. We're going to the development banks to raise an additional $7 billion. So don't forget to times that by 17.4 to get the rand number. Our debt to GDP level is likely to reach 80%, which they're predicting will spike to 140% in 7 years' time. Like it's almost inexplicable, actually. But again, let's leave that because most of us are long-term traders, not day traders. So let's zoom out and take a longer view. This is the graph of the US dollar rand exchange rate from the beginning of 1992 until last night. You'll notice something every global investor already knows. The rand is what we call a structurally weakening currency, almost like every emerging market currency. So here's the Brazilian real, the Russian ruble. By the way, that weakening you're seeing there was from 2008 until last night, 180%. It's just crazy. And of course, the Indian rupee, all pretty much the same, structurally weakening currencies. So back to our rand, and let's see how our presidents have performed from that period I showed you of 1992 until 2020. So graphically, Thabo Mbeki and Jacob Zuma are clearly the obvious losers, right? You'll see this huge spike in the currency, which means that the rand has weakened during their tenure. And of course, I think you'll forgive me for not putting up a picture of Ivy Matsepe-Cassaburi. Remember her? She was president of South Africa for all of, I think, 14 hours. Judith will correct me on this. But at least let it be noted, South Africa has had a female president. Okay, enough of the feminism. Let's take a slightly deeper look at the currency we are so bound by. Pretty much the same graph over the same time period, but slightly more accurate, I would say, because it reflects the average dollar-rand exchange rate per year, rather than the previous graph, which shows you the actual spot exchange rate per month. And I think this is just a fairer reflection of presidential terms. More importantly, it's overlaid with some of the major global financial crises. So you can see that de Klerk, the red line, had no major global crises to contend with, while Nelson Mandela presided over the Asian financial crisis, which, by the way, is not shown in the graph, but was hotly followed by the Russian debt default crisis. Mbeki had to contend with the dot-com bubble, where, quite frankly, no one had any idea of how long it was going to last. And in reality, nobody wanted anything to do with risky assets. And let me remind you that shares and currencies are considered risky assets. The black line is Motlanthe, and clearly he seems to have performed the best, being in the thick of the global, despite, I should say, being in the thick of the global financial crisis, but he was there for such a short period. I'm not sure you can really attribute the beneficial currency return to him. And actually, you know what? I don't think I'm even emotionally strong enough this morning to talk about Jacob Zuma, because really he presided over the longest bull market in history, where every global investor was looking for yield, a bit like I think what is going to happen in the next couple of years. You know, there's just no yield in the equity markets, and so people are going to look potentially for emerging markets, yielding bonds, perhaps, just for some sort of return. You know, so Zuma presided over the longest running bull market in history, and still he couldn't attract investors to our shores and to our stock exchange. Okay, have a look at this graph of the rand exchange rate between 2008, so I've shortened the period of it, and 2019. I'm going to point out some of the biggest rand depreciating events. First, we had the global financial crisis from September to October 2008, where the rand lost 47%. So the global financial crisis basically was the housing boom in the US gave rise to a subprime lending crisis. People couldn't afford what they were mortgaged for. These kind of dud mortgages, as you call them, subprime, were then sold off to banks through intricate financial instruments, which triggered a massive crisis of confidence in the financial sector, eventually pushing it to the brink of collapse, the financial system. Investors sold off all risky assets, particularly in emerging markets, and fled to the safe haven US dollar currency, which saw massive gains during this time. Then we had the Eurozone crisis from September 2011 for 3 weeks from the beginning of September, where the rand lost 22%. The future and stability of the Eurozone was in question at the time, and the result was influx to, or a rush, I should say, to safe haven currencies again, like the US dollar and the Swiss franc. Investors wouldn't even see their way clear of investing in emerging market currencies such as South African rand. May to the 11th of June 2013 brought the taper tantrum, as we call it, which saw the rand lose over 16%. This infamous taper tantrum was a global sell-off triggered by the surprise announcement from the then Fed chair Ben Bernanke, saying that the US central bank was considering scaling down quantitative easing. This was when the US pumped massive amounts of money into the economy, which really kept markets very buoyant. And so basically they were going to withdraw this lifeline, and markets had a tantrum, basically. Over the course of 2013, the rand lost almost a quarter of its value. And on top of that, at the end of 2013, we had Nenegate. Remember that late one Sunday evening call when President Jacob Zuma unexpectedly fired Finance Minister Nhlanhla Nene and appointed David Weekend Special van Rooyen. Luckily, just right next to that, if you look just outside of my little red circle, or oval, I should say, the fall was halted by the appointment of Pravin Gordhan. And then there are really no distinct events in 2014 through to 2016. And I can only attribute the rand's grind weaker to the market's concern over what Zuma was doing behind the scenes, and there's just constant news flow about matters of corruption. For a week in January 2016, the rand fell 14.7% due to what we call the Chinese meltdown. This is when Chinese authorities repeatedly had to halt trading on their stock exchanges to actually stop this kind of disastrous flow of fall of share prices. This instability triggered large losses on global markets, and as China is the biggest consumer of commodities, and we've seen what we're seeing then was this slump in metal prices. Of course, South Africa, being large platinum and gold producers, was pretty hard hit as well. Then shortly after that, on the 30th of March, Pravin Gordhan was fired as finance minister, which caused complete havoc in our local market, and was followed very quickly by the credit rating agencies downgrading us. And then again, soon after that, this effect was just compounded by constant rumors of Gordhan's arrest. From the 9th of August 2018 to the 13th of August 2018, the rand's 16% fall was attributed to the Turkey turmoil, they called it, where economic fallout from diplomatic spat with the US soon snowballed into grave concerns about Turkish debt situation. So I've kind of run through that very quickly, but you know the saying, when the rest of the world sneezes, we get a cold. It appears that when the rest of the world is an emerging market country that sneezes, South Africa gets what I can only describe as an economic version of COVID. Sorry, I know that's a lot of information. So let's take it back to our simplistic graph of the rand US dollar exchange rate, where we note that the rand has weakened from 305 in 1992, when de Klerk was still president, to 1739 last night, which is almost 500% if you just do that simple. Industry that goes, live in the sun and invest in the shade. So live here and invest offshore or in the Northern Hemisphere or in UK or Europe where it's a bit colder than here. And if you had done that, you would have missed out on the JSE's over 800% return from 1995 until last night. This is a graph of the JSE All Share Index. And what I'm trying to show you here is that the share market seems to be inversely correlated to the rand exchange rate. So as the rand weakens, the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, or the shares listed on the JSE, in fact strengthen or rally. You know, And the reason for this really is that approximately 70% of shares listed on the JSE are in fact what we call Rand hedged shares, which means that when the Rand weakens, those companies make more profit because they're invested offshore and they repatriate their revenues back to Rands. So obviously a weaker Rand gives them more bang for their buck. Another rule we need to be cognizant of as investors is that your assets need to be where your liabilities live. In other words, it is definitely a good idea to have investments offshore, but if you are spending or planning to retire in South Africa, there is a risk that when you need to bring your money back to South Africa, there is a chance that at that time, the Rand could actually be stronger. And while diversification is crucial to building a portfolio, I mean, absolutely crucial, and I highly recommend that everybody has offshore exposure, or at least, I should say, exposure in one developed market currency. The problem with the Rand, much like with our politics, is that it is a very emotive topic. And when our politicians do or say something wrong and the Rand blows out, that's when South Africans wake up and want to take their money offshore. So can I please at least ask you to not call me when the Rand suddenly falls out of bed, but rather when it strengthens? I mean, can we at least agree on that? So I've given you a bit of a background on where the Rand trades and how politics influences the currency or the exchange rate. And I'm delighted now to introduce you to my very long-standing old school friend, Judith February. She is as Carl so rightly pointed out, many things, including a cricket fan, author of a book. And what you don't see if you go onto her Twitter handle is that she's in fact a very critical thinker, very pragmatic. And in her book, she wrote, "It has become increasingly clear that the ANC, even with new leadership, will not be able to fix our society, and nor should we expect it to. If political parties are too caught up in their own power, plays to map a way forward for our country and give meaning to vision of our constitution, then we as citizens must do it, even in the context of our divided, complex society. It will take a mammoth collective effort from business, civil society, and communities to rise up and speak out against the inaction fueled by those who would consign our country to the dustbin of corrupt politics." And I think you can see what happened when I showed you the Zuma years, what happened to our Rand as we heard news of corruption coming through. She goes on to say that Obama once said, "If you're disappointed by your elected officials, grab a clipboard, get some signatures, and run for office yourself. Show up, dive in, stay at it, stay at it." And you know, I can't disagree with this at all, because I do feel a lot of the time we lay the blame at politicians' feet for so many things. And what I want to know from Judith is, if I am there and I'm going to do my absolute best and work hard and try and rebuild this economy, where to from here? Like, what exactly is the political situation? How comfortable can I be with the political situation, knowing that it has such a huge impact on the Rand? So over to you, Judith.
Thanks, Anthea. Can you hear me all right? Because I can't, my video is...
I can hear you.
Perfectly.
Okay, great. Well, thanks very much, everyone. Anthea, it's great to be here and to be with you all this morning. Yeah, nobody is ever emotionally strong enough, I think, to talk about Jacob Zuma. So, Anthea, you are not alone. There we go. I've got my video fixed. I mean, it's interesting, Anthea, that you remind me of that quote that I used in my book towards the end of 2018, and we were just sort of coming out of a terrible period of time. I think that I mean, my interest in democracy and institution building is really that, and I do think that in a sense, if one looks at the way in which democracies develop, South Africa is 26 years in. And so in a way, we're a sort of little baby. We are, we're sort of trying our best to work in what is a very difficult environment right now. And really that quote about that Barack Obama did, that was his final speech to the United Nations in his presidency. And it really was going back to his roots as a kind of citizen activist. And in a way, we all have to become more critical citizen activists. And that means doing things like this. I mean, it sounds very simplistic, but that's exactly what it means. And it means engaging with our democracy in a more substantial way. I think what happened, and what happens in many democracies, is once we got to 1994, we sort of sat back in a way and went, well, you know, Mandela's a good guy, and so we can trust him. We can trust him to kind of do the work of democracy for us. And I've worked in civil society organizations for 20 years. And what you saw was a kind of tapering off of people's involvement within our democracy. And then during the Mbeki years, which were relatively good years for the institutional capacity of the state, and for somebody who talked, you know, sometimes talked with a forked tongue, Mbeki, I mean, we can go into his faults, but generally speaking, he understood the business environment. He had Manuel Ramos Mboweni. He had a strong team treasury, and also was able to shore up the support within treasury for sort of ANC government benefit, I would say. And then we had the Zuma years, and we saw the ANC sort of imploding in a sense. But in fact, that implosion was coming through Mbeki's own actions, I would say. So what I think the coronavirus, and I've written about this, what I think the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us is that, firstly, will we come out of this? And I've been thinking a lot about this. How do we come out of this? Do we come out of this stronger, or do we come out of this weaker? And for me, particularly around, I mean, Anthea, you can talk about the economics, but it's about our democratic institutions. And so how do those come out stronger? And we definitely are, I think, in a phase of rebuilding at the moment, given the weak capacity of the state. And what the COVID-19 pandemic has laid bare is it's laid bare the fact that the state, we have an incapable state. And so on top of all of this, you know, Ramaphosa, so he talks about an inclusive economy and all those things, those good things which serve everyone. But really what you're doing is you're doing that on the back of a state, which really is incapable mostly of delivering. And so, but back to your question, it's a long way around, but I do think that these things, I mean, what the Obama quote tells us is that these things really are, we're in it for the long haul. And it is about citizens demanding accountability in big ways and in small ways. And that's a kind of boring, unsatisfactory answer. But unfortunately, what Obama goes on to say in that quote, and he's right, is that democracy is the work of generations. And sometimes we take 2 steps back and we can take 2 steps forward and take 3 steps back. And you're seeing exactly that in the United States. If we want to be depressed about our democracy, and I must admit, I'm also feeling a little bit sort of gloomy this morning after yesterday's supplementary budget, because it shows the wasted decade under Zuma and everything, you know, at a time when we need, in 2008, we had a bit of padding. Now we have absolutely nothing. We're throwing ourselves at the mercy of IFIs. And so, but if we're feeling gloomy about that, we can look at the United States, and we can look at somebody like Donald Trump. And for all of the checks and balances of the American system, we find that actually the president is pretty unaccountable. And in fact, that those checks and balances are only as strong as, firstly, often the person in power and their desire to want to stick to the rules, and also those who are around him, who their desire to stick to the rules and to hold him to account. And it will be citizen action in the United States and here, whether it's through voting, whether it's through protest, which is going to possibly change that narrative. And that means, and we can go into kind of details about micro action that citizens can take. And I mean, I've been involved in many campaigns over my 20 years of working in civil society. One of them was, and here's an example of how this is for the long haul, is around private funding to political parties and how political parties should be accountable for the funding they raise so that we understand how policy is made. Well, you know, that campaign started in 1997, even before I started working on it. And this year we have a law, which is, so that's 20 years in the making. So what it shows is that there are really no quick fixes. And unfortunately, there are no quick fixes for the problems we have with regard to the institutions. But it is about demanding it. And I think through business, there are various ways in which business can. I think in the Ramaphosa presidency, there's a better chance and a greater understanding, I think, of what needs to be done. But Ramaphosa himself, and I'm sure we'll come to this, he has constraints. And so that, that causes a paralysis or a stasis. But and then it is about, I've also been involved in the Right to Know campaign, which is about the protection of information bill. That secrecy bill has only now, since 2010, has Ramaphosa sent it back because it's got constitutional flaws. So anyone hoping for quick fixes around citizen action and so on, there are no quick fixes. And this is the work of generations. It's for the long haul, and it's about using all of the advocacy means at our disposal, and what Samantha Power calls a toolbox for dealing with democracy. And business will know what's in its toolbox, and in civil society we do. And we as individuals need to know what's in our toolbox locally, provincially, nationally. And that's, it's tiresome work in a sense.
Judith, before I hand you back to Carol and to the audience for questions, I have a question for you, which kind of worries me, and I think I'm probably tainted by previous or by history, and that is that the governors of the Reserve Bank and the finance minister are appointed and serve at the pleasure of the president. And yet there's been constant talk of this attack on the Reserve Bank's independence. And I think it was partly kind of a consequence of state capture that was going on at the moment. How comfortable can I feel, should I feel, in your opinion, about what's happening at the moment and how, or whether or not the South African Reserve Bank will stay independent and that we will appoint the right finance minister for the job?
That's an interesting question, Anthea, because it comes and goes. So firstly, just the background to that. At the ANC conference in 2017, I mean, I'm sure you all know this, there were certain resolutions passed. Now, the ANC is a slow, cumbersome organization, and it is deeply, deeply divided. There's a factionism which renders it apart, really. So Ramaphosa, when he wins at Nasrec, he wins with a divided mandate, and therefore, and all those factions come to the fore. Second point to make is that there are a lot of people who stand to lose quite a lot in this new kind of dispensation, despite the fact that we're hearing stories around corruption. A lot of those taps have been turned off. And as those taps are being turned off in the Ramaphosa presidency of trying to clean up the state, and that's a long process, is the rhetoric will rise, the rhetoric about, and those two, and the proxy battles that are being fought, and land is one of them. And we've seen at Nasrec, and I talk about this quite a lot in my book, about how the ANC people nearly came to fisticuffs because of the resolution on land. And eventually there had to be a compromise around amending the constitution. The mandate of the Reserve Bank is something similar. And so what we will see is, what we've seen throughout the Ramaphosa presidency really is a kind of tussle between these two, the radical economic transformers, or what I call the radical economic looters, and a sort of a reform wing of the ANC, a kind of social democrat wing of the ANC, who Ramaphosa and his colleagues, who desperately know what needs to be done, but are constantly in this tussle. Now, nobody really, the question about the mandate, I feel quite relatively comfortable about this. I think that because to change the mandate of the Reserve Bank, you have to amend the Constitution in terms of Section 224. Also, the head of the ANC's Economic Transformation Subcommittee within the party, Enoch Godongwana, is a generally sensible individual, and I'm sure people on this forum have maybe had occasion to have conversations with him. The problem, though, is that the radical economic transformers will carry on, together with their friends in the EFF, will carry on raising this issue as a whip over Ramaphosa, and to create a situation of stasis. And that's what we have at the moment. It's the paralysis. It's the fact that Ramaphosa actually, he feels torn by his party. And so we need to see the debate on the mandate of the SARB as a proxy battle, which will raise its head as these things do, because it's a way of that flank of the party getting back at Ramaphosa, trying to pull him back, and so on. I can't see it happening. I think there's so much going on, and that brings me to the next point about Tito Mboweni. Tito Mboweni he's a maverick. He's an outsider. He is an eccentric. I mean, anyone who follows him on Twitter will know that. So it wouldn't be beyond the realm of possibility for him to simply say, sorry, I pack up and I go. I don't think, and that will be his sort of personal decision. I mean, yesterday I thought he seemed a little bit flat. I think if it's up to Ramaphosa, he would want to keep him there for this term, because I really think that, they both know that we can't afford yet more flux. And also the problem is that the ANC, there's so little leadership on the second tier that actually now we have to bring back the former governor to do it. But it is well known that Mboweni is, that he's sort of fed up with the people within the party who are economically illiterate. I mean, to be perfectly honest. So when Esma Khashula talks about, I don't know, he quantitative easing, but he doesn't really understand what it means, that's a problem. So I can't see that shift happening right now. If Ramaphosa wins the second term, I think that will be exit stage left for Mboweni. So unless something dramatic happens, I see him staying and at least managing this post-COVID crisis. The issue around, just the last point around COVID-19, ironically enough, and I've described this paralysis and the stasis within the ANC, ironically, my view is that, in fact, what COVID-19 presents Ramaphosa with a renewed opportunity to actually act. Not talk about an inclusive economy, not talk constantly, have a symposium, a commission, this, that, that we are awash with talking, and talking is great, but at some point you have to do. And so I'm happy about the infrastructure symposium, but can we act on that now? Because it's kind of like everyone knows what needs to be done, but nobody wants to do it. So, and I think that Ramaphosa, with due respect to him, and he understands the ANC better than I do, but I think he has a real moment here to use his power to expend it. Because in fact, the radical economic transformers do not have a candidate at the ready that they can pull out of a hat. And all people who are talking about Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma as a stalking horse, her time has passed. If she wanted to really oust Ramaphosa now, which she can't, she would have done that. She was beavering away until COVID-19 brought her brought her into our lounges, unfortunately. But I mean, she is not the candidate. Ace Magashule, these are not candidates for the presidency. So in fact, we've got a local government election happening next year. If Ramaphosa wants to, he needs to exercise his political power that he does have. And I would use this opportunity to make the changes that are needed, because actually the ANC needs Ramaphosa. Their electoral support in the last election, 57%, was poor. They lost a lot of votes. You've got, we won't get into the DA and the EFF, but be that as it may, and that was only because they ousted Zuma. So really, he needs to use that political power, and he needs to do what he needs to do, and he knows what he needs to do. And not be so cautious. But unfortunately, we are dealing here with somebody who is deliberative, and with somebody also who is very consultative, and so that will just continue and continue. And I think that's a problem for South Africa, because he needs to expend the political power, because you can either be a lame duck or you can expend the power, and it would be very hard for the ANC to remove him, given the fact that the party is so fractured and the party is so just weak. And South Africa has an ANC problem, and Ramaphosa knows that, and so he has the ability to kind of sort of rise above the party, go with the slings and arrows, and do what needs to be done. But he's reluctant to. That's a long answer, Anthea, to your question.
But a good answer. So thanks very much, Judith, and thanks, Anthea. The Rand, currency and politics, we've certainly got emotions going from people on the forum with strong views, which is fantastic. So Judith, I'm going to kick off with you. You talk about active citizenry. You talk about an opportunity for the president and perhaps us to rebuild. How do we do that? So the people on this call, we're interested in investment. We're interested in economics. Many people, I think, are cynical about their ability to do anything. I would suggest that most people on this forum might not even be able to list the DG in the finance department and a couple of members of the Reserve Bank, but we all have very strong opinions. So how do we get more involved? How do we become active citizens rebuilding this economy? What is our job?
Well, our job, Carl, is we need to be informed, and we need to engage. I think that the worst thing for democracy is for us to be cynical. And I know it's really difficult because in South Africa also a million things happen in a day. And if you wanted to, not get out of bed and be depressed, well, that's an option, because actually there's so many things that one can be depressed about. I am, so for me, I'm an incrementalist. So I believe that things sort of change over time. South Africa, though, at the moment, what we do need is institutional change. And I'm afraid some of that is one is at the mercy of a kind of Ramaphosa, some of that of the ANC. So if, for instance, we look at SARS, what you do need is you need good people there, you need the rebuilding. From what I've heard is that there is institutional renewal going on there. The problem, and I think that one has to keep calling for that, because what I hear a lot from people is people saying, oh, but nothing will change. It's pointless because the ANC does what it wants, or and so on. But people need to be, for me, that's just not a way out. We need to be constantly putting these ideas on the table, and whether that is through business, through the forums that you have, I think that is very important. Whether it's having these sorts of forums and having generating the ideas, and creating those networks and creating those institutions. But those ideas. But I also think that it is, business itself, I think, has to take an inward step. There's been a lot that's also come out of, let's say, the Zondo Commission around collaboration between business and the state capture project. And so it wouldn't be amiss of business to also, take an inward look and say, how are we complicit during those Zuma years, all of us, And us as citizens, where we weren't sharp enough, where we didn't go, actually that is something that we need to step down about. You know, businesses who continued contributing to the ANC, to their conferences, you know, despite the fact that they knew that Zuma was a crook, because actually the status quo suited them. So for all of us, I think, and also civil society, did we miss a beat? I mean, I think of, for example, when the public protector, the new person, Advocate Mkhwebane, we were all in the room monitoring this process. And what was it that we missed about this person who seemed to be brought in and who seemed to be all right? We didn't do our homework well enough on her, you know, to create the storm. And I think that media has a strong role to play, but it seems, and also that I don't think business can separate itself, and I know it's a fine line, separate itself from the politics which happens out there. I mean, I talk to a lot of business people and they go, well, that's not really for us. I mean, in the early 2000s, I had tens of meetings with people in business about the question of campaign finance. Nobody wanted to touch it. Nobody wanted to touch it because, you know what, politics doesn't concern us and we don't want to touch it. Actually, we all have to touch it. So it also is a question of going there and saying the hard stuff. And the hard stuff needs to be said, even if, and there have been lots of examples through the Mbeki years, Zuma years, and so on, there will be name calling, there will be the slinging of mud, because eventually, you know, for those who spoke out during the Zuma years, well, the truth is there for all of us to see now. And so it's important, I think, that that's speaking out. And I don't think one must underestimate that voice, and also that voice happens in different ways and on different fora. And so, and to get to know who the individuals are, who influence things, I think who's who in the zoo is very important. But again, Carl, as I said, I'm an incrementalist. So I believe that we are at a point now in South Africa's post-democratic trajectory, which is, it's precarious, and we are in a rebuilding phase. And a lot of that rebuilding with regards to the capacity of the state is reflected in the dysfunction within the ANC. But one can, in various ways, you know, try, whether it's by monitoring the parliamentary process. I mean, I also think that, you know, businesses should be far more concerned about what's happening at Parliament, because actually that's where people get appointed in many of the instances. And I don't see that many people engaging. It's sort of seen as a nicety. Engage there, because that's where, because decisions are made, and it's actually quite, not an easy way, but it's a way of placing pressure on those individual MPs, and also coming to a sort of perhaps a conclusion or an endpoint which is a compromise on kind of the very extreme positions. So, I mean, and then, you know, in my book I talk quite a lot about litigation. I mean, that is also one way of, and we've used that a lot in South Africa, but really it's down to citizen groupings. If you look at what happened in the United States in the 60s around civil rights, people were organizing locally, very locally, to influence accountability where they are. And so businesses, I think, can do the same in terms of their chapters, in terms of business unity, in terms of those organizations that you have, but also by all the points that I've made before, which I won't repeat.
Thank you, Jill. I think that's well put. And for me, a couple of words to highlight is we mustn't become cynical. We're all involved, get involved, and we need resilience and grit, because it's not always easy. So there'll be Twitter trolls and there'll be people attacking, but don't give up. So Anthea, a couple of questions for you. Mike mentions Nedbank suggesting that the rand could strengthen to 15 to the dollar in the short term. Do you agree?
I definitely think in the short term, we'll see some strengthening to the rand. Before yesterday's budget, so kind of, I don't know, 3 or 4 weeks ago, I was looking for 16.50. But of course, yesterday's budget brought up a whole lot of issues, mostly what the finance minister said very eloquently, the hippopotamus of debt. And that's a big issue, because also he said that for every tax rand that they get in, 21 cents of that is spent on repaying the interest on debt alone. And if our debt does spike to more than our GDP, in other words, our expenditure or our debt as we to our income, our revenue that we're generating, then we have a real problem, in which case, you know, we're probably looking fairly, I should say, for downgrades, and really have a very negative impact on the rand. And so I guess I haven't changed my mind. 24 hours is actually just not enough for me to update models and to re-look at things. I was looking for 1650. 15 seems a bit too strong for me, even when global economics or other countries are struggling. And now I must admit, I'm probably going to be looking closer to. So yeah, a stronger rand, I do think, but not 15. I can't see that happening shortly.
Thanks. Anthea, we had a comment around, if I understood your point correctly, that over a long period of time with the rand weakening to the dollar, instead of rushing, putting our money overseas, if we'd kept it here in the JSE, we would have seen that growth that was far better than the depreciation. So Luke is saying, well, if we did take our rands overseas, we also would have gotten the benefit of the rand weakening and the share price increasing overseas and the shares we would have invested there.
And sure, I absolutely agree. The other benefit we have is hindsight. You know, what we don't have is the benefit of a crystal ball. And so it's very much this personal, appropriate investing. So as I said, if you have liabilities in South Africa and you're invested offshore, and the minute you need to bring your assets, your offshore assets back to South Africa, what happens when the rand strengthens? Unfortunately, you don't know whether that is going to be a reality or not. And you've seen this rand strengthen, right? So if the rand then strengthens at the time that you need to bring your money back to South Africa to pay for your liabilities, to pay for your pension, to pay for your living expenses, to buy a home, a car, whatever your liabilities or expenses may be, and then you could end up being out of pocket. I cannot disagree that you need to be invested offshore, undoubtedly. And I particularly think so now. You know, I think it is going to take a while for South Africa to rebuild its economy. We actually just don't have the safety net or the buffer we needed going into this crisis. We just didn't take advantage of global growth in the last 7 or 8 years, whatever it was. And so we are probably going to take longer to rebuild than other countries where there are probably some great opportunities right now. So yes, if you have time and if you understand volatility and appropriateness of your investments, then, you know, as much as you need to, you can send offshore.
So a final question for you, Anthea, and then one for Judith, and then closing word from Anthea as we start wrapping up. So agreeing with you that we need to diversify offshore, Anthea. You've spoken in some of these webinars in the past about bond market and other ways that we could do that, but we seem to be a little bit fixated with the US, and we equate offshore with US. I mean, is that true, fair? What are the opportunities for South Africans, and how do we do that? I mean, how do I physically take my rands? If I'm a sophisticated, high net worth individual, I'm sure my financial institution helps me. But how does that happen?
Okay, so one question at a time. So the first question, is offshore only the US? No, obviously not. You know, the US makes up, I believe it is, off the top of my head, 23 or 24% of the global GDP. You know, South Africa makes up less than 1%. So yes, you kind of, you know, this diversification rule of looking to see where growth is going to be. I am very concerned about Europe. It's a bit like South Africa in the last 2 or 3 years. It just hasn't taken advantage of global growth and has kind of stumbled along its path of growth. And so would we want to be there? What we're doing at the moment is particularly looking at sectors, you know, and tech sectors are not just Amazon, Facebook, Google, you know, they're also Samsung and a whole lot of Japanese tech companies where there could potentially be growth. And I don't advise you to go and buy individual shares. I'm always talking about diversification and understanding what your negative and positive impacts are going to be. But there are a number of ways to do it, and there are a number of currencies to choose from. And the way you do it as an individual investor is actually really easy. You need to find a platform that offers you offshore exposure, or can offer you the FX exchange and then the ability to buy either ETFs or shares offshore. And as an individual in South Africa, we don't forget, have foreign exchange control regulations. So you can take without any problems, basically, just report it to the Reserve Bank, up to R1 million offshore, no problems. If you want to take more than that, you can take an additional 10 million rand. All you have to do is apply to the SARB. To be honest, if your tax affairs are in order, you've paid your tax like a good citizen should, then I generally don't see them saying no to you. In fact, I've not had a single customer rejected by the Reserve Bank up to now, touch wood. And then anything above that, you do actually need to speak to an asset manager, because we can do something called an asset swap for you. So come and have a talk. Just pick up the phone, send me an email, and we'll have a discussion around how you can do it.
Great. Thanks, Anthea. Judith, a little bit of an international question and putting you on the spot. I saw on CNN this morning that proposed changes of legislation in Russia might have President Putin there until 2036. We probably have Donald Trump in the White House until 2056. How are we impacted as South Africans by foreign politics? Now, some might say that's a stupid question. Of course we're impacted. But currently, with the dynamics that you described, how much leeway does President Ramaphosa have to ignore what's happening internationally?
That's a fascinating question, Carl, because I sort of thought about it this morning, because I was reading an article by Fintan O'Toole in the Irish Times about the rise of fascism and how it rises. And there he was using the example of Donald Trump. And I think, and it got me thinking about governance and democracy. So what the world is heading towards a kind of, I'd say, a crisis of democracy. And for a country like South Africa, where we're a new democracy, it's even more dangerous, I would say. But having said that, I am optimistic about South Africans' desire to protect and defend our democracy. In a sense, we had Zuma, almost a decade of Jacob Zuma, and we know what that looks like. And obviously we know what apartheid looks like. And I look at the United States and I look at people becoming complacent about institutions, about the courts, about all kinds of things, right to protest. I mean, it's extraordinary that, in South Africa, we would have had litigation about a lot of things that the Americans are getting hysterical about in the media, but there seems to be no outlet for them to deal with it. So I'm more optimistic about our ability to protect and defend. Also, if you look at what's happened in lockdown, I mean, there were a series of challenges to citizens, and immediately the death of Collins Corsa, I mean, people were there, they were protecting their rights. And now it's about holding those ministers to account. But it does impact on us in terms of what is happening. So that crisis of democracy, whether you are Donald Trump, Erdogan, Putin, Orban in Hungary, that it creates a climate where if the most powerful person in the world, Trump, is starting to take tests on a kind of fascism and in sort of limiting rights, then it gives license to every leader around the world to try and do the same. And so therefore, I think these are precarious times, and we need to be alert. We must not be cynical, and we need to exercise our democratic muscles, because we know what a kind of authoritarianism and fascism look like. So we need to be alert. But I do think that President Ramaphosa, for all of his faults and for all of what people say about him, he is a Democrat at heart. I mean, he has, I mean, I know there've been issues in the lockdown, but I think generally speaking, he understands that framework. Now, not everyone within the ANC shares that, but I do think we have a restive population, and we have people who understand what democracy is, and whether you're poor or whether you're wealthy, people understand their right to speak out, their right to strike, and also the media. And that's why my last point is that it's important for us not to be cynical, and also for business and all of us not to ignore what the media does, not to stop supporting it, not to stop supporting and write off civil society organizations that seem on the fringes. We need to be supporting those organizations, because that's ultimately how we are going to protect and defend our constitution, and being interested in knowing what's happening at that court as well, which has been an important buffer between us and a failed state. So it definitely influences the democratic theory. And because if you look at the 1990s, for example, you look at the fall of the Berlin Wall, all of that, I mean, that influenced what happened in South Africa. It wasn't just Mandela, it was global events that influenced what happened in South Africa in the fall of apartheid. So we can't ignore those.
Thank you very much. And thanks both Anthea and Judith for challenging and inspiring thoughts. And there's some great questions from Elma and many others that would also be controversial, like the potential implosion of the DA because of Helen Ziller, and many other questions which sadly we can't get to. The link to this email will be emailed to, or this webinar will be emailed to all the attendees. Unashamed plug to buy Judith's book, Turning and Exploring the Complexities of South Africa's Democracy. I'm sure you've all read Anthea's book by now, Money Matters. If you haven't, get her book. But follow these guys on social media, engage, don't become cynical, use your rands to make some more money and contribute to society. So Anthea, thank you. Judith, thank you. Best of luck, and have a good rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.